The Glendale Road Church of Christ proudly presents a weekly exploration of the Word of our living God. This is It Is Written with Minister Stephen Hunter.
Oh, let the ancient words impart. I don't wish to be morbid in addressing a topic such as when we die, and I surely don't mean to add to someone else's sorrow because of a loss they may have recently or over some span of time suffered. However, I do believe that there's a great lesson in this passage that we would all do well to take note of, and also to give ourselves a bit of self-examination in the process. One of the things that I want to point out is the reason that Jesus gave this story to begin with. And so if your Bibles are open to Luke 16, I want you to notice verses 14 and following. There it says, "The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard all these things, and they derided him. And he said to them, 'You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your heart. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God.'" And of course he goes on from here and then ultimately leads into this story of the rich man and Lazarus. And what you notice is because the Pharisees prided wealth, this was something that Jesus wanted to correct in their thinking. Now, I want to ask you to think about something. Just entertain the thought. You don't have to buy into it. Could it be that oftentimes when we say to God in prayer, "Thank you for these blessings," usually we're speaking of material wealth. Could it very well be that sometimes the things we look at as blessings are actually curses? Just think about that for a second. Because the Pharisees had this way of thinking, and their way of thinking pretty much was, if you were wealthy in life, God has blessed you. And if you were poor in life, you must have sinned, or your family must have sinned some way, somehow. And because you were poor or downtrodden, then you were judged in this life by God. One of the constant themes throughout the gospel that Luke wrote has to do with stewardship of wealth. And when you look at Luke's gospel as a whole, this really is fitting into the central message, and that is that you can't trust always in riches, and you can't trust in wealth. And so the Pharisees did this, and there are many people who probably still do today. And they may have even thought, like some of us do, well, we have all these materials, we have all this wealth, God has blessed us. But more important, what Jesus shows, it bears on all of us. What do we do with the material blessings that God has given to us? And so he goes into this story. And the rich man, you notice in verse 19, he's clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. So here you have the rich man, and it just fits right in. Purple was a very nice color. Some of you have on purple, I see. And in those times, however, purple was more associated with wealth, with royalty at times. And so here he is doing very well each day. And then in contrast to the rich man, you have a beggar named Lazarus. Not only that, but Lazarus was full of sores, and he was laid at the rich man's gate. And all he just wanted the crumbs that fell off the rich man's table. If you were to find the statistics on this, you probably wouldn't be shocked, but we probably waste more food than we actually consume. I remember when Stephanie was attending Murray State years ago, they had this panel where they spoke to people or interviewed people from different countries who were students here at Murray State. And this one lady who was from Tajikistan, which was part of the former Soviet Union, she talked about all that she liked about the United States. And then when they got around to the question, what is it that you don't like about the United States? This one lady from Tajikistan said, just how wasteful you are with food. I don't like that about this country. She said in Tajikistan, where she and her mother lived, they were given rations every other day. And what they were given as rations every other day equaled to a very small meal that they got to eat every other day. And she said, and I see you here, and you have these big feasts. And if you don't finish it all, you throw it away. Now think about that. And I've often guilted my children about that, going, what you throw away, someone would just love to have. Now, some of you were brought up in a time when you didn't have much, and so you cherish every morsel that you have. I remember there's a sweet sister who's since passed away that lived in New Concord. Some of you may have known Miss Lucy, and I remember Miss Lucy, you did not waste anything around her. Miss Lucy would reheat up coffee to drink. Now, that's something I just can't do. It's got to be fresh. But now with Miss Lucy, you did not waste coffee. You didn't waste anything. And you know, some of us, it's funny, we go into some of our parents' or grandparents' homes, and you know what their Tupperware is? Emptied Cool Whip things, right? Because they don't waste anything. They keep everything, and and Miss Lucy, man, she had an entire room full of that stuff. And so we who are younger and very wasteful, we could do a lot better by observing those of our generations who were much older than we are as to how they use things, how they stretch the value of a dollar. You've probably heard phrases such as that. But in our prosperity, we are often very wasteful people. And oftentimes what we are willing to waste, someone else somewhere in the world, if maybe not even in this county or city, would love to just have what we throw away. And that's all that Lazarus wanted. He just wanted the crumbs that came from the rich man's table. And so sometimes we make these big, lavish meals, and we may put it in Tupperware and stick it in the fridge. I know I've done this. Our family's done it. Maybe yours has too. And guess what? You forget about it. Or guess what? You go, I don't want that again. It's kind of like the day after Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving Day, it's like, that's probably why we only have it once a year, right? Because at the end of Thanksgiving Day, we are sick of turkey and dressing and all these other things. And then you go back over to Grandma's house a month later. Y'all come over, we're going to eat. Okay, what we got? I still got some of the ham and the turkey from Thanksgiving. We're going to heat it up and eat it. We're going to finish it off, right? Some of you know how that is. Lazarus, he just wanted the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. So today when you leave and you go out and you eat, look at what you have left over. And what I would love for you to do, and I think the Lord probably would too, I want you to think, there's somebody here in this world that would just love to have what I'm about to throw away. And so it was that Lazarus was so pitiful that the dogs came and licked his sores. Now, for a Jewish person, dogs were unclean animals. When you call, we kind of use it jokingly today, oh, you dog, right? Well, that was an insult then. We use it just, joshing about. But it was an insult. And so the fact that he had this unclean animal coming and licking his sores really demonstrates the pitiful estate that he was in. And so in life, the rich man, he had his quote-unquote blessings. Lazarus, however, he had it rough. But here's the reality. No matter how rich the rich man was, and no matter how poor the beggar was, guess what? They're still buried in graves. The equalizer, death. Doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter how powerful you are, doesn't matter how much stuff you have or don't have. Likely, all of us will wind up in the same place, 6 feet beneath the dirt. And none of it will have mattered. None of it will have mattered. But here we get to the afterlife, and this is one of the few passages that deals with what happens after death. And so if you've got a notepad you want to take notes, that'll be great. If your Bible is still open, that'll be fine too. But I want to point out 4 things from this passage that we learn about what happens when we die. First is, we go to one of 2 places. In verses 22 and 23, both of them died. And I want you to notice that Lazarus, is carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. Now, Abraham is the father of the faith. It's because of Abraham that the Jews were who they were, and they often claimed their kinship with him as proof that they were the chosen people. And so for the Jewish person, the bosom of Abraham, you're going back to the father of faith, a place of comfort here in the afterlife. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. Now notice a few things from this passage. You have one place in the afterlife that is comforting. You have another place in the afterlife that consists of torment. But now also notice from this passage that the rich man recognized Abraham and he recognized Lazarus. People often ask me, will we know our loved ones after we die? And the only answer I can give is, well, the rich man knew Abraham, the rich man knew Lazarus. So I would say, yeah, based off that. But what's very important is why each of them went to their places. Why was it that the rich man, who thought in life he had been blessed by God likely, why is it that he went to a place of torment if in life God has so blessed him? You see, sometimes the things we think are blessings actually turn out to be curses. And it's not that the thing in and of itself is the curse, but what we do with it. The rich man lived lavishly. He lived very selfishly, whereas Lazarus, in the life that he lived on earth, he was poor. He was miserable. And so when we die, we will go to one of two places. Secondly, we will be conscious and we will feel. The rich man says, being in torments, he says, I am tormented in this flame. Some people have taught that when we die, it's just like we sleep and we'll wake up at the resurrection and it'll be like we took a nap. No, not true. When we die, our spirits will be in a place, we will feel, and we will either feel the comfort of the afterlife or the torment of the afterlife based on how we have lived this life. Do we live it in faith and in faithfulness to God? Or do we live it perhaps in faith to God, but selfishly? Now, I think it's interesting that Abraham is the person set up as comforting Lazarus. You may recall all the way back in Genesis chapter 18, you have the three visitors that come to Abraham. You have the Spirit of the Lord and two angels. This is right before they go into Sodom and Gomorrah and before God judges the place. And as soon as they approach, what does Abraham do? He runs to them, he invites them in, and he gives them hospitality. So Abraham, he didn't know these guys, but yet he was hospitable to them. Whereas the rich man in Luke chapter 16, he knew Lazarus, but he was inhospitable. And so here you have the mark of the person of Abraham and the hospitality for which he stood. Now, what's even more striking about Abraham's hospitality is that previously, a few chapters before Genesis 18, Abraham had been in Egypt with Sarah, you recall. And it's when they had to tell Pharaoh, hey, she's my sister. Say you're my sister so they don't kill me. Now, I've read a few Greco-Roman sources about ancient Egypt, and the Greeks and the Romans and pretty much everyone who was an Egyptian viewed the Egyptians as the most inhospitable people on the place of the earth. As a matter of fact, when strangers would come to their shores, they would often kill them and sacrifice them to one of their gods. And so Abraham and Sarah had sojourned in a very inhospitable place, and they came out of it, and you may be prone to think, well, maybe that inhospitality would rub off on Abraham, but it didn't. And so these three strangers come while he is sitting by the oaks of Mamre, and he takes them in, he gives them food, he gives them drink, and he gives them shelter. He gives them hospitality. Not knowing who they were, having previously been in an unwelcoming place. And so Abraham, we could probably argue, had every right to not be hospitable. After all, he might have learned it well from the Egyptians. But he was despite it. And so Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham because Abraham, even in the afterlife, welcomes those who others don't want to. The rich man knew Lazarus. He was laid at his gates. He likely saw the sores. He likely saw how pitiful he was. Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. So we will be conscious and we will feel, but we will also retain our identity. Abraham says to the rich man, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted and you are tormented. The rich man was still the rich man, and Lazarus was still Lazarus. They didn't get a whole makeover. They didn't get a new identity. They were in the afterlife as they were here in this life. But finally, there will be no second chances. Abraham says, besides all this, between us and you is a great gulf fixed, so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us. Even in torment, the rich man still didn't get it. He still thought that Lazarus was meant to serve him. Father Abraham, send Lazarus over here that he may dip his finger in water and dip that water to cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames, the rich man says. He still doesn't have a healthy perspective of Lazarus. And so then he pleads with Abraham. He says, I want you to send Lazarus to my father's house because I have brothers and I don't want them to come here. One of the things in studying the Bible with people is that they often wonder, well, if I do this, does this necessarily mean that my loved one here, there, or yonder is in hell or in torment? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know this much. If any of our loved ones are in a place of torment because they didn't live faithfully to God, they don't want us there with them. Because the rich man finally shows a little bit of selflessness and says, go and send him to my brothers so that they won't come here. But the answer was quite clear and plain and simple. They have Moses and they have the prophets. Let them hear them. Or as we might summarize, they have the Scriptures. Listen to what the Scriptures say. But Lazarus, rather the rich man, no, if you send somebody from the dead, they'll listen. I promise you they'll listen. If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to be convinced if someone is raised from the dead. That was the end of the matter. When we die, we go to one of two places. When we die, we will be conscious and feel. When we die, we retain our identity. And when we die, there will be no second chances. The die will have been cast. And so what do we do in this life? Do we have faith and live faithfully to the Lord? Or do we live faithlessly, or maybe have a partial belief in the Lord, but we don't do anything with it? Faith without works is dead. That's what James tells us. If the rich man truly believed that God was who He was, he should have treated Lazarus better. The second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. The first being love the Lord your God. You know, if we were to just love the Lord our God as we should, that would take care of what we live and what we do in faith with God here in this life. If we would just love God as we should, we would reject a lot of the things that we often praise and that we often find a lot of good in. Let me just tell you something, and I'm nobody's judge, but I want to point out something that I saw Friday night that really kind of bothered me. And it has nothing to do with any of our folks here. But we went out to eat Friday night, and I know it was homecoming. And we were sitting there waiting to be called for our table, and there were two couples sitting there. And when they got called, they stood up and went. And God forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm just sitting here wondering what mother and father let their daughters walk out of their house dressed like that. Here you have these two beautiful girls who were dressing in such a way to invite attention that no one should want. One of them had to as much pull the fabric from a certain place because it was, and parts of her body were hanging out that shouldn't have been hanging out. Are you getting what I'm saying here? I'm trying to be very tactful, which is not one of my strong points. Okay? And I'm sure that maybe she has great loving parents. But I think, why would they let her go out of the house like that? I don't understand it. But I thought, if we all just really loved God as we should, modesty wouldn't have to be preached on. If we all loved God as we should, drunkenness wouldn't have to be preached against. If we all loved God as we should, it would lead us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And we wouldn't be backbiting and treating one another as we sometimes shouldn't over issues pertaining only to this life. Now, we all have our opinions on various things that are happening in our society. But do we love God as we should? One of the hardest things to do is to just not say anything. Isn't that hard to do sometimes? But I've got to say something. You've got to love God with all your mind, with all your heart, and with all your soul. And if you'll start loving God, you'll look at the cross, and there you will see the love of God poured out upon all the earth. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. If I love God, I look at that cross and I see redemption, I see hope. And if I love God, I hear the commandments of Jesus. And if I believe that Jesus is God's Son, well, that will naturally lead me to want to repent, to change my manner of thinking, and to refocus my mind. And I want to be born of water and Spirit, to have my sins washed away in baptism. If I truly love God, I want to live as a Christian should live. And one of the biggest problems we have are that Christians seem to want to live as heathens. But it all goes back to the root of the problem. Do I love God how I should? If I love God how I should, I won't be so worried about when I die, nor what place I'll go to. We have a song that we often sing, "Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine." Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. If Jesus is not yours, if you have not loved God as you should, please come to the front and let us assist you as we stand and sing.
This has been It Is Written, presented by the Glendale Road Church of Christ. We welcome your visits and communications at any time.
With God's own heart, Oh, let the ancient words impart.